Good morning, fish keepers. Thank you for joining us. It's Friday. I hope you're well. John and I are here. You happy, mate?
Yeah, I'm good. One step closer to the weekend, Cam.
What is that you're drinking? Is that a Lolly Water RTD or is that something actual, not alcoholic?
Non-alcoholic.
Okay, cool. All right. Let's stop mucking around. We'll bring up our guest. Good afternoon, Father Fish.
Well, hello. How are you, gentlemen?
Good, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. Nice to be here. Nice to be in New Zealand and Scotland at the same time.
Gets me every time. A bunch of people that like fish can just connect from around the world and talk about fish.
Oh, it is remarkable, isn't it?
The joy of the internet. Cool. All right. So can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you've done in the hobby, and a little bit like that, please?
Well, I'm 84 years old, and I've been in the hobby, I think, since I was born. My grandmother had fish, and I grew up next door to her. So some of my earliest memories are of fish tanks. And I have had a fish tank, at least one, without a break since I was about 9 years old.
Wow.
Probably sooner, but at least then. So I've had fish all my life. I've done everything in fish. It was not my vocation. My vocation was as a missionary Christian minister. I served disabled people, primarily people who are deaf, so I know sign language. But I retired from that about 25 years ago and have taken up fish as an avocation. I've had several shops. I've worked on fish farms. I've worked as a salesman, as a broker, as a breeder, as a hobbyist.
Yeah.
It's kind of, been all over. I helped found the National Aquarium in near DC some years ago in the late 70s. So just been around fish all my life, and somehow none of it has left me. People ask me questions about fish, and I remember everything. It's amazing. I could easily forget my own name, but I don't forget anything much about fish.
That's the thing when you love something like a passionate hobby. It never goes. Not even if you try to.
I think that's right. So lately, for the last 5 years or so, I've been building a YouTube channel, and it has done quite well. I've been able to spin off from that an online business that has a couple of employees, a Discord server that has about 20,000 members. And we are now moving on to all of the other social platforms. We've determined to not be dependent upon YouTube, but to be on all of the platforms, and then center our activities around our Discord server, which may become a forum, a Google-based online forum. We're discussing that now. The store, and I have a currently very small Patreon account that I'm looking to expand in order to provide a more in-depth study of the hobby.
Cool. Very good. What were you looking at, or going in depth with more?
I beg your pardon?
What were you looking at deeper diving into when it comes to that study?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I have a lot of contacts, a lot of people who have been in the industry or very deeply involved in the hobby. For example, a number of friends have been raising killies for many, many, many years. I have a friend who developed the glowfish. He actually did all of the research and the breeding for it. So, plus there is a deeper, I think, a deeper walk that serious hobbyists want to engage in, but have a difficult time finding. It's really not so much accessible in the format that YouTube or some of the other platforms provide. So it'd be an opportunity for a more intimate, more personal, more in-depth study of various aspects of the hobby. Breeding rare and endangered species would be an example, I guess.
Yeah. I think, like, because we speak to people every week, and the general consensus is there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of information that's quite hard to digest, to get it from expert languages, expert knowledges into a easily digestible, I don't want to say bite-sized amounts, but to be used and consumed by the end consumer, and that there's a big gap between that, and to bridge that will be a massive thing for the hobby. And personally, I think it'll stop a lot of the old boys club sort of scenario, the I know the information, you don't know it type of thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
You've been doing some of that. You've been interviewing some pretty advanced people. You know, I think that's part of it. The difficulty is it's hard to separate that from the casual fish keeper who has one tank in their living room that is more an art piece than you know. One of the things I focus on most directly is natural aquariums. I'm really committed to helping people understand how their aquarium can literally be a natural environment. And that's not something that is particularly popular in the industry. In fact, the industry as such really doesn't appreciate it at all, because it doesn't sell chemicals and it doesn't sell fancy equipment. You know, it doesn't sell medications and all of that.
Very much so. Can you go into that a little bit for us, please?
Sure. I guess for me, it started with a man named Merle Cohen, who back in the 1950s started in the hobby, started in the industry. He opened a shop. He began importing. He developed using plastic bags to transport fish, putting air in the bags. I mean, just simple things like that. He developed the formula for quick cure, which was one of the first pharmaceuticals. He traveled worldwide and came back from the Far East with a in the 1960s, the late 60s, with a vision of being able to keep saltwater fish in a natural environment. He had found some people who were doing that, and he began instituting that. Well, it did not really get picked up until a group of people in Idaho started a coral breeding farm based on natural principles. They called themselves GARF, GARF, the Geothermal Aquatic Research Facility. They're still online. They no longer are a physical facility. Out of that grew Amano and then Wallstead.
Mm-hmm.
They began putting together the idea of what a natural aquarium would look like, how you could actually achieve it. I got involved in that in the early, like around about 2005, about 5 to 10 years after Wallstead's book came out. And I was struck by two things that she said in her book. Number one, her system depleted in about a year. And number two, she could not keep her water from becoming overloaded with nutrients.
Okay.
So I took this as a challenge to try to resolve those issues and began doing two things. I began capping the soil with sand rather than gravel because sand prevents water from flowing through and washing it out. And it began developing a formula for supplemental material, organics and chemical, mineral primarily, minerals that could be added to the substrate that would give it a longer life. Those are probably the two major contributions that I've made. I've developed a soil package that the formula is available. It's available to anyone who wants to use it. I also manufacture it and sell that as a package deal, and I sell the supplement. It has about 14 primary elements in it, all of which are geared at making the substrate last long enough for the entire tank to begin to fully cycle, so that when a leaf dies on a plant, it goes through the entire process of biodegradation, enters into its biochemical consistency, is taken up by the plants and returns to the plant. The same with food, going through that entire cycle. It takes a very long time for that to become established. It's a matter of years. So the idea is to have a soil, a substrate that will literally last for years. And I estimate the substrate, as I've constituted it, is good for about 5 years, which is long enough for the tank to fully cycle itself. What that means is you wind up with a system that is fully balanced, fully stable, and is able to sustain itself with very little intervention.
Cool.
I'll stop there.
Has this plant substrate package, has this been built from experience, or have you kind of worked out that it needs this and this and tested for this? How have you kind of developed that formula?
Oh, very much through experience. I've been working on it for about 20 years.
You're right. Wow.
And I have literally thousands of people who are using it.
Yeah.
Once in a while, somebody fails miserably, but usually it's because they've done something to create excess nutrient in their tank, which has fouled the water. Barring that, it's pretty foolproof.
Okay.
It's an inch of the soil, 2 inches of sand filled with water, with at least half the tank full of plants, lots of plants, and beginning with fish right away. Now, some people feel as though the fish have to be kept at a minimum, but I've not found that's true. I have tanks with a lot of fish in them. I was just looking. Actually, I could take my camera and walk around the store a little bit and show you all of the tanks. Every tank in here is a deep substrate tank. You can see the dirt and the sand above it. These are Valenti gouramis. I don't know if you can see them. I don't have a lot of those in here because it's a pretty delicate fish. There is a pair of rams in there with them. I have Batis in here, Congo tetras, some checkerboards, I think. Moving down, this is a guppy tank. There's a little arowana in here. I put him in there because I thought he might be able to feed on the baby guppies. Neons, these are green neons down here. They're about 100. Yeah, such a pretty fish.
I'm a big fan of the green neons. So I think they're
really
cool.
I love them. It's
criminally underrated.
My absolute favorite. And these are just a bunch of small cichlids. They're acaras, and there's some buffaloes in here somewhere. I don't know where they are. Some wild rams, and some parrot cichlids.
Are your tanks all slightly tannin stained, or is it just coming up on the camera like that?
Probably are, yeah.
Yeah.
Partly because I use a lot of leaves, tree leaves, fallen leaves. That becomes the basic food for the tank because it's feeding the microfauna. And the microfauna are then feeding the small fish. For the bigger fish and all of the other fish, I feed a lot of shrimp, food shrimp, the kind that we buy in the supermarket.
Cool. So that is like a primary food source that you feed out?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That and the leaves, which of course are growing microfauna. So this tank is 2 months old, and it has grown that carpet in just 2 months.
We've had a question from one of the watchers. Only Oscars has asked, do you add fish food to your tanks?
Well, the only fish yes, I do. I do not use, for the most part, I do not use commercial fish food. I use ground up shrimp, food shrimp, and I use these leaves that feed the microfauna, particularly in tanks where there are very small fish that are able to feed on microfauna. But I also feed the shrimp as a paste for the tinier fish. If I do feed, it'll be a very high quality pelletized food. I like, for example, golden pearls, which is manufactured by Brine Shrimp Direct here in the States.
Okay.
These are one you might like. You know these guys?
Is that I can never.
Waru.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. One of my all-time favorites.
How do you get on with fish that like to dig, rip, and pull at plants? Like Waru, obviously, they like to have wee nibble on plants, and African cichlids, for example, like to chew. Is that a method that you can use with that sort of fish?
these Waru are they pretty much devastate plants. You can see this tank is pretty unplanted. They've torn up a lot. I try to find plants that don't tear up so much. Curiously, the Aponogetans are a plant that survives predation.
Interesting.
I think it's very curious. Snails, like pixie snails, will not eat Aponogetans. And most fish won't. I think they must taste toxic or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Must do.
This is my Australian tank. All my rainbows.
Beautiful
They're
fish.
finally beginning to color up. It's taken them a while to start coloring up.
It's unfortunate they take so long to color up because they are phenomenal fish. They're incredibly hard to sell because they take so long to color up.
Yeah. And grow up. My word, they take so long to grow.
We've had another question off the floor. Only Oscars again has asked, if I can grow plants with only a sand substrate, why should I add soil? The plants are growing and look amazing. I don't like to fix what isn't broken.
Well, what has happened is your tank has developed a soil base by virtue of mulm precipitating into the sand.
That makes sense.
So over a period of time of 6 months to a year, there will be a significant soil base under the sand. So you're achieving the same thing. You're just doing it more slowly than if you put, these are scarlet batis primarily.
So it's the decomposition of food and fish waste debris that creates like a sediment base to the aquarium naturally through the sand.
Yeah, exactly. So I do not clean my substrate, nor do I do very much in the way of water changes.
No, neither do I, actually. I've had an aquarium running for 2 years and I've never done a single water change on it.
I do it when I need to, when it needs to be done. But very often it does not need to be done. I don't know if we can get close to this. This is a tank we put together as an Amazon floodplains tank. I found a tree on the beach here at the Chesapeake Bay that had been dried out for years, and put it in here. You can't see the trunk. It's quite large, actually. This is a 60-gallon cube. And the idea is to show what happens when the forests flood in the Amazon and the fish come up and are actually breeding around the leaves and branches of the trees. So just kind of a cute idea. But I have discus in here. This is a lot of tannins because of the tree. We have a lot of carbon in a canister to try to keep it down some, but it gets pretty dark. Makes it a little hard to see what's in there.
Nothing wrong with that.
We've had another question.
Yes.
Helen would like to know, what happens to the substrate if you keep burrowing fish like cooliloches and eels?
I beg your pardon?
What happens to the substrate if you keep burrowing fish like cooliloches and eels?
Well, they don't really, let's see. Nothing. If anything, they are helping to, in the same way that worms or any other kind of animal working in the soil would benefit it. I have cooliloches in a lot of my tanks. They really don't. They don't dig. Um, Probably the worst one is the geophagus, because even though they don't dig, they're moving mouths full of water of sand
Mm.
at a time, and
Mhm.
eventually will dig pits. I find with them, I just need to go through the tank once a week or so and level it back out.
Yeah. So the deep substrate technique is something that you advocate, I'd imagine, to anybody that asks for advice on
Yes,
setting an
I
aquarium.
do. I do.
Over the
Yeah.
years, is there a common challenge that people that are doing this for the first time come up against? Is it something? Is there is there normal things that people find difficult about this or should look out for?
The biggest challenge is simply that it is counterintuitive. For many people, they can't imagine putting dirt in their tank. That sounds dreadful. And they can't imagine not cleaning it. That sounds dreadful. So, a lot of the advice I give is runs counter to what people naturally think they ought to be doing.
Hmm.
I don't want people to be cleaning their tanks all the time. I don't want them to be changing their water all the time.
Hmm.
I do want them to have dirt in their tank and a deep sand bed and not gravel, and to be filled with plants. So,
Yeah.
those are all things that are problematic for a lot of people who really have not been around the hobby very long, or who have gotten in a pattern of maintaining uh, a, what I refer to as a sterile tank. People who keep big fish are a good example of that. They'll have a bare tank, maybe
Yeah.
a little bit of hardscape with an inch or so of gravel, or maybe nothing, and they'll every week they'll do a major water change.
Hmm.
Well, the reason they do that is because if they don't do that, the water is going to foul.
Yeah.
So they need to do that. It's critical because of the way they're running their tank. So what I'm suggesting is, if they put 4 inches of sand in that tank and feed about half of what they're feeding now, they won't have to do water changes more than once every couple of months.
Well, that's it. I
And,
mean,
and the fish will be healthier. One of the difficulties, I think, and I've been around this long enough and have done enough long enough to know that the water changes is a two-edged sword. It'll get you in the end. Eventually, you'll do a water change and everything will die. It is almost, and it might take 10 years for that to happen, but eventually it's going to happen, because eventually something will happen to the water supply that'll be dramatically different. If it's municipal water, somebody's going to throw an extra truckload of chemicals in the water,
yeah.
or something that will just have a devastating effect on the tank. I'll give you a good example. I was keeping fish in Sarasota, Florida, and I had severums, and they were doing quite well. And I was doing regular water changes. This was in the 1990s, doing regular weekly water changes on them. All of a sudden, they're sick. They're breaking out. They're getting their slime coat is dropping. They're getting fungusy. They're droopy. They're just falling apart. And I tried all kind. I got a vet to look at them. He gave them shots of something. God knows what that was. Didn't
Wow.
do a thing. It took me months. I finally called the water company and asked them if there had been any change in the water. And they said, no, just what we normally do. And I said, oh, what's that? I said, well, they said, normally our water comes from deep wells, artesian wells, which is very hard, very alkaline water. But in the summer, we buy water from the next town north, Bradenton, which is lake water. It
Ah,
is very soft, very acidic. So they go from hard alkaline to soft acidic with no notification, and it devastated the fish.
Wow.
And that kind of thing can happen without you knowing about it. And that's simple. I mean, that's not even toxic, really. That's just a change in the
Simple
water
chemistry.
chemistry.
yeah.
Mm, mm.
And if you're doing a big water change, that's going to have an effect,
Exactly.
regardless of
So
how
water,
good
yeah,
you're going to.
water change in that case is the worst thing you can possibly do.
So when you say dirt in your aquariums, are you talking about like just going digging in the garden, taking out the weeds and throwing it in, or is there a specific blend or a
Well,
specific
that's what
type?
Wallstead did. I've taken that to the next level. I've looked at the components of it. I studied terra preta for a long time. Terra preta is an earth that was concocted by apparently the Aztecs or the Incas in South America, which is a miracle soil. It's literally 1,000 years old, and it enriches whatever it's put in. In the process of examining that, I discovered that things like peat moss or some other kind of fibrous coir material,
Mm-hmm.
a carboned material, a composted material, and a good rich black earth are
Mhm.
three critical components of healthy soil. So I combine peat moss and potting soil and a product here in the States called Black Cow, which is a highly finished manure.
Mm-hmm.
It's a composted manure. I combine that with my supplements, which is about 14 different ingredients, a
Mhm.
lot of minerals, some biologicals. It has things, oddball things in it. It has simple things, like, for example, it has baking soda in it, and it has bone meal and blood meal. It has things to buffer, to maintain a stable pH.
Yeah. So, did you sit down with agricultural people or aquaculture to come up with this formula, or was it a trial and error?
Yeah, yes, I did. I most recently have been working with the folks who are doing organic gardening. There's a big movement here in the States, really all over the world, I think, to do organic gardening on an industrial scale.
Right.
And it's really based on building the biological foundation of the soil, building the microfauna, the microculture in the soil. So that's a big part of that. That was kind of the next step I took after I got the product put together. Then I realized it needed life in it. So I literally recommend to people that they go out to a local pond and gather some leaves, rotting vegetation from that pond, and bring it back and put small amounts of it in their tank at a time, along with dried leaves. That brings a biological diversity into the tank that establishes it as a natural environment.
Okay.
We've had another question. I've seen a number of people saying they used bagged compost. How do you get around the risk of Legionnaire's disease using these products?
By introducing a broad diversity of biologicals. In nature, those problems don't exist. Let me give you a good example. Ick is the very best example. We have, anybody who's had fish for a while has had an ick outbreak, an ick infestation, in which every fish gets covered in it and they start dying in a matter of days. It takes about 1 week for an ick infestation to kill everything in the tank. That does not occur in nature. The ick parasite is in nature, but you never find fish covered in ick. And the reason is the biodiversity of a natural environment is killing and eating those parasites as they hatch and begin to look for a host. In other words, microfauna, 50% of all microfauna and macrofauna are parasites. But they are parasites that parasitize on each other. Most parasites eat other parasites as their natural food. There are very few that really attack larger animals. Those that do tend to be controlled in their numbers by the sheer diversity, the biodiversity that exists in the environment. In an aquarium where you don't have that biodiversity, a parasite like it can get in there. In 3 days, it's multiplied by 240. In 3 more days, it's 240 times 240. And by the 7th day, it's overwhelming. In an aquarium that has a strong biodiversity, you don't get ick infestations. It just doesn't happen because when the babies hatch, they get eaten up by other parasites, by other microfauna. You may find 1 or 2 spots, but you're not going to find a fish covered in ick.
Helen has asked another question. There's a very broad statement regarding ick. I've been keeping fish for over 50 years and only ever have had 1 fish with a few spots that came right quickly with treatment.
Okay, I missed what you said there.
She said, that's a very broad statement regarding ick. I've been keeping fish for over 50 years and only ever have had 1 fish with a few spots that came right quickly after treatment.
Yeah. After treatment, before treatment, what did she say? With treatment or without treatment?
With
treatment. Well, then the treatment worked. I'm not opposed to treatment, although I find the best way to cure ick is to increase the temperature to 30 centigrade, and that causes the ick to drop down into the soil and become inert, and in 4 days it dies for lack of a host. Ick is a cold water parasite. It cannot tolerate warm water. You increase the temperature to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 centigrade, and the ick will not function. It'll become inert. And if it doesn't have a host for 4 days, it dies. So I find that the simplest, the most effective way to cure ick is to increase the temperature to 86. I usually kick it up to 88 just to make sure I got it warm enough.
Mm-hmm. Increase the temperature, increase the diet. I find if you find a garlic-based food, that spikes their appetite, and when you increase the temperature, it speeds up the life cycle of the ick. And if the fish are eating more because of the garlic, it builds their natural immunity to help them fight it off. It's not 100% successful, but that's usually my go-to whenever I suspect itch.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for bacteria particularly.
Mm-hmm.
Bacterial infections, another matter. Odynium is another matter. I find with odynium, it really requires medication. It's just so difficult to get rid of otherwise. You can do it with salt, but I really don't like to use salt because then you have to do water changes to try to get back to normal, and you've thrown the balance out in your system. And it also tends to it tends to hurt microfauna. Medication does too, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
But on balance, I find the medication is just a little safer.
Cool. So we've had another question from the floor. Do you recommend starting a father fish type aquarium from scratch, or could you adapt an existing aquarium?
You know, it's kind of funny. Most people who have taken the next step have created an under gravel filter system. That's kind of the next step. The under gravel filter is really interesting because as it's working, the water is going through the gravel in channels, and as the detritus flows through, it blocks up those channels. So you wind up after a year or so with a gravel bed that is packed solid with waste.
Mm-hmm.
If you usually that's when, oh golly, it's terrible, it's not working anymore, I got to tear it all down and start over. If the person would not do that and would simply take the lift tubes out, cap it with 2 inches of sand, they would have the best aquarium they ever had. Because they would have an aquarium rich with nutrients that would grow tremendous plants.
Mm-hmm.
It would have a plenum in it, and I'm not convinced I understand what's good about plenums, but you know, they're not harmful. And the sand would cap it and keep it all down in there, and allow more detritus to precipitate into it.
Tropica used to do a soil that was very similar. It was a dirt as opposed to an aqua soil.
Yes.
And it was one of the first ones that I ever set up a purposeful planted tank.
Yeah.
And I had to cap it with at the time I used a white gravel, which was just crazy. But
yeah, that's right. It's very good quality stuff. But if you don't cap it, then it's gonna bleed out.
Mm-hmm.
It'll lose all of its potency.
Yeah. The only difficult thing when you're dealing with something like that is when you want to maybe move some plants, or if you're trying to propagate and you're cutting and moving, because the minute you pull something out of that base, it's just.
Yeah, I did a video about that not long ago. It got 1 million views. It was a short. Yeah, it was a short, and it's called jiggling.
Yeah, push down.
where you jiggle the plant to break the dirt loose from the little hair roots. And then when you pull it out, you don't get very much dirt coming out.
Yeah. Low and slow.
Is there better plants for doing your method, or do they all kind of work in the same principle? Because obviously they all grow differently. They've all got their own different growing styles, speed styles, all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
There's some that are better than others.
Well, yeah, and the other thing is, some plants will not grow with the soil at a given state in its age or development. The soil is changing all the time. It's maturing. For example, when you first set it up, there are a lot of raw chemicals in there, and they are at war with each other. They go through a process of chelation where they're basically reacting to each other to the point where they finally resolve all of their reactions and achieve a stability. That process is referred to as chelating. When that happens, then the soil then is able to grow plants that it could, like cryptocorenes. Cryptocorenes require a more well-developed soil than do stem plants.
Mhm.
So you can get tremendous growth out of stem plants right away, but certain other plants you won't be able to get much growth. Now there's another factor too, and that is that the plants determine what it is they need, and actually they send out hormones that affect the bacteria in the soil, such that it eats certain chemicals and creates a compound that the plants need for that specific state of their growth. For example, if they're growing stems, they send out a hormone that causes certain bacteria to eat certain chemicals to create what they need to grow stems, as opposed to leaves and flowers. So if you put fertilizer in the tank, you're overwhelming the plant with one particular chemical that it may not need at that point in time, that will affect its natural growth cycle. So if it's a chemical that grows leaves, you're going to get leaves, but you might have very weak stems.
Right.
That's
Can you go
that's
into that a little? I didn't know that was a thing. Can you just explain that, or
I don't
give a
know
little bit
that I
more?
understand it much better than that.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know the process by which the plant releases hormones. I know that's been researched and it's been discovered, and I've read the what's it called, the synopsis of the research that says this is what happens and this is what it does. So I know that much. I don't know the science of it though.
Yeah.
I know that plants release hormones, and the hormones, they release hormones based on what their stage of development is. And the hormones affect bacteria, and certain kinds of bacteria that do certain kinds of things. So there are thousands of kinds of bacteria in the normal environment, species, if you will. They're not really species. Bacteria is not really alive, but for the sake of discussion, I think we have to talk about it that way. So the plant will release a hormone. It will it will be picked up by or responded to or will affect a certain type of bacteria that does a certain specific thing to a certain specific set of chemicals in the soil and creates of them something that the plant needs for that particular period in its growth, that particular time in its growth. And so if it's growing roots, it'll have a hormone. If it's growing stems, there'll be a different hormone. Leaves, a different hormone. Flowers, even another. So if you interfere with that by putting a fertilizer in, that fertilizer is providing one specific nutrient that does one specific thing, typically growing leaves or flowers. So you wind up, for example, with corn that is fertilized to be able to produce fruit. And that's all it does. It doesn't grow roots. Its roots are an inch long. It falls over once it, once it fruits. It receives a fertilizer that does a specific thing.
Wow, I did not know any of that. Cool. That's absolutely opened my mind a little bit.
So fertilizer, I do not recommend using fertilizers. I recommend using a diverse soil with a lot of biological material in it to be able to generate what the plant specifically needs when it needs it. In other words, trusting nature to do what nature knows how to do that we only think we understand.
Do you ever notice things like yellowing or leaf curl or anything like that occurring, or does it just not happen?
Sure, it does. Yellowing happens when the soil is when the soil's not ready. We're not when we create this, we're not creating something that's been around 1,000 years. We're creating something brand new that has to go through a process. Now, it's got material in it like peat that's been around for a long time, and that helps, but the composite of all of it is really creating a new environment, and it takes time for that. I have an aquarium. My oldest aquarium is 24 years old.
Oh, wow.
It's a deep substrate aquarium that I have never done anything to the substrate. It's had a lot of changes in plants, changes in water, changes in fish, all of this. But the substrate itself is the same as it's always been.
Do you find with an aquarium
plants like weeds?
See, with an aquarium running for so long, do you find that a deep substrate would reduce in height and you've got to cap it again and cap it again, or with it being like silica sand, it just remains?
Well, I find that you need to add more sand periodically.
Right.
Because it fills up. The detritus that's sifting into it is bringing the soil level up higher and higher. And it'll get to the point where you'll have half an inch of mulm all over the top that can't get down in it because it's full. So you add an inch, half an inch to an inch of sand to create a media for that mulm to be able to penetrate. Eventually, and this has happened in my big tank, eventually it gets so deep you have to remove some of it. So, and this has happened twice for me, where it got about 6 inches deep, because I find I have to add about a half an inch of sand every year or two to be able to compensate for the fact that the waste that has gone down in it has built up the soil foundation and just made it thicker.
Yeah.
So I'll go through every couple of years, about every 2 years, and I'll take out 2 to 3 inches and replace that with an inch of sand and just kind of start over again. You know, if I had a tank that was 4 feet deep, I could let it go a lot longer. But I wouldn't be able to get down there and plant anything either. I had a deep tank once, and it was impossible to do anything with. I couldn't. It was an acrylic 3.5 foot deep tank.
Nice.
That had those cutouts on top, so I couldn't get in it. It was a big tank, but I couldn't get in it, and I couldn't reach down in it. And with tools they were really not very effective, so I was kind of stuck.
Yeah. I've had a 3 foot deep aquarium in the past, and I know exactly what you mean. You find yourself balancing over it, and it's just never. It doesn't end well ever.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. You got to be able to get down in there to plant plants. You know, when I plant a plant, my finger goes down in there about an inch. I mean, that's how I plant. I push the plant down. I push the crown of the plant down into the soil, into the sand, about 1 inch, and then I cover it. That's my technique. So I got to be able to get my hand down there to do that. And I can't do that with a tool very well.
Very true. So when you're talking about these self-sustaining ecosystems and the deep substrate, how do you find a balance between allowing nature to do itself, you know, to do what it does best, and still maintaining it as a hobbyist and trying to interact with the aquarium? What's the balancing point? I mean, how long do you leave it without?
It's a great question. I've had a number of people ask me that, and I basically have 2 answers. And the first answer is, now you're ready to become a guru and meditate on your tank. That's one answer. The other answer is, start another tank. So it lends itself to the multi-tank syndrome.
Yeah, I'm okay with that theory. I don't mind setting up another tank. I'm down for that.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions come up from the watchers. The first one is, can alocasia plants be used in aquariums? Alocasia.
What is he referring to?
I believe it's a house plant or a non-full aquatic plant.
Well, yeah, the roots are, I mean, the roots will generally thrive. The leaves will not. The plant needs to have its leaves out of the water, but its roots very often, there are some plants that don't like their feet to get wet. Violets, for example, don't live in marshy areas. But any plant that can survive in a marshy area will love having its roots in the water. It will not love having its leaves in the water because it does not breathe water, it breathes air. And it will drown if it's in the water.
That makes sense.
Cool. We've got another question here from Stephen. He would like to know, can I just take soil from a lake or a riverbed and cap it with silica sand?
You can. The problem is it is intensely rich. I recommend, if you're going to use pond mud, that be 1/4 of your soil. Half of it should be peat or coir or some other, or leaf mulch, something like that. and then another fourth, some kind of good quality soil. In other words, if you use the mud as an alternative to a finished compost, that's a good trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
But to do it strictly that, I've done it and it doesn't work because it's far too strong and it just basically burns everything up. Unless you have a pond, if you're digging down, now maybe right on the surface would be one thing, but that's so muddy and so soft, it's hard to do much with it. So you wind up pushing that aside and going to where it's firmer. And when you do that, you're into something that is so intense and so strong that if that's all you have, you can cap it with sand, but by golly, it's gonna blow a lid through that sand. It'll blow a hole right through it. It'll foul the tank in a matter of a day or two.
Wow.
It's too intense.
Cool.
Next question we've had, Todd would like to know, are certain lights better for plants than others?
Are certain
Lights.
lights? Yeah,
Yes, light.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, lighting he's asking about.
Lighting, okay. Yeah. This comes up all the time. And frankly, my attitude about light is I like the new LED floodlights. They're cheap, they're strong, they have the spectrum basically that is close to the sun spectrum. It's a white light.
Mm-hmm.
And I find they work amazingly well. I use 100-watt floodlights, LED white floodlights on virtually all of my tanks. Either strip lights or the pan type. I just don't spend the money on expensive lights. My lights cost about $20 to light the tank, and it grows plants. And that's really all I need it to do.
Cool. The next question we have is it okay to have houseplants growing out of a father fish tank with leaves above? I have pothos and such growing out of my tanks.
I think it's very nice. I don't have much growing out of mine, and the reason is I keep lids on my tanks because I don't like evaporation. And if you have lids on your tanks, you cannot have plants growing out of them very well. I know there are ways to do it. I simply haven't figured it out yet. You could build a tray that would be subsurface, that would be part of the cover that has holes in it, and you can put the plants in that. I simply haven't done that, but I think it's a wonderful thing to do. I love plants growing out of tanks. I just don't do it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And Todd would like to also know, so we're doing this as a substrate. How long roughly would you need to wait before adding fish back to into its aquarium?
24 hours.
Cool.
Immediately. Put plants in day one and a few fish in day two. Keep in mind when you put fish in, there is not very much of a nitrate cycle going on. It's there, but it's just beginning. So putting a very few fish in will help increase that. It'll help build it. After about a week, it'll be strong enough you can add a few more. So do everything slowly and gradually, and you won't run in any trouble.
So essentially, you're rolling with a fish in cycle. How does the fish in cycle work with your methodology for care of fish, as well as balancing everything? Obviously ammonia spikes, nitrites, all that kind of stuff. How does that work? How does that cycle? How does that principle work?
Well, by putting plants in right away and really loading the tank up with plants. I recommend, for example, we sell a package of stem plants. It's 16 different bundles of stem plants. We recommend that for a 10 or a 20-gallon tank. So that's a lot of plants in a little tank. But we recommend starting that day one, putting that number of plants in the tank day one. Plants absorb ammonia directly through the leaves.
Yeah.
As well as nitrates and nitrites. So you don't get ammonia spikes if you have a lot of plants in the tank.
So basically, the plants are absorbing the toxins before they
That's exactly
begin
right.
to be toxins for the fish to be affected.
That's right. Yeah, but by the same token, you don't want to put a lot of fish in right away. I mean, if you put 50 fish in a little tank or a new tank, a 55-gallon tank, you put 50 tetras in there and a few plants, it's going to all be dead by morning.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put some plants in it, a half a dozen fish, they'll be fine.
Okay.
Because you won't be creating stress on the system. You'll be putting biology in there at a level it'll be able to cope with and grow, nurture.
Yeah.
I strongly agree with you. When people set up planted aquariums, they often start with not enough plants. Like the amount of people come into my shop and they go, "Look, I'm starting up a new tank.
Yeah, one or two.
Plants.
Right.
I
I want
want
to
to
start with that plant. Give me that plant."
Yeah, and they want to go, I'm going to do it, plant it heavy. They buy 3 bunches for a 50 litre or whatever. Like, buy more. Like,
Yeah.
it's not trying to sell
And then
you
they
more.
come back. Why did
trying
my
to help you be
plant
successful.
die? Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think we need to change that mindset, at least with plants, and
Well,
load up
strong. Yeah,
load
I
up
agree.
early.
The way I get past it is I sell it by the bag.
Yeah, right.
I sell a bag of plants. I sell a stem plant bag, a rooted plant bag, and the specialty plant bag. And it's a flat rate for all three.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 18 rooted plants in that rooted plant pack, including swords, vallisneria, cryptocorenes, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Algae is a very natural part of all aquariums. If you've got water in a box with lights above it, chances are you're going to get algae. How do you combat algae in your style of methodology? Is it a concern? Is there more algae that pops up than others? How does that work for you?
My theory is that algae is less effective at absorbing nutrients than plants are.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have more plants, you will have less algae. You defeat algae with plants. Now, there are exceptions to that. Hair algae is an exception. Hair algae seems to have a mind of its own. But hair algae is very easy to remove because it's one long strand. You just grab it and pull it, and it all comes out. And if you do that often enough, like once every week or every few days, you'll get it all out pretty in fairly short order. But by and large, algae is not going to grow in a heavily planted tank. Also, there may be an excess of light. Yeah, I find if I have too much light in the tank, I'll get algae no matter how many plants I've got. If I cut the light back, I can control the algae. And for some algae, if you cut the lights off completely for 2 to 3 days, no light at all for 2 to 3 days, when the light comes back on, the algae is gone.
Do you find it occurs more at setup, startup time, or just does its thing when things are slightly out of balance?
It's a balance thing, I think. You know, there's some tanks that are just troubled by algae. I have one I'm looking at right now. I had an algae problem in it that I completely redid the plants 2 or 3 times, did water changes, cleaned it out, I finally put another inch of sand in the tank, and that solved the problem, which said to me that it was leaching nutrients from the substrate. It wasn't adequately capped, and it had too much nutrient in the water column for the plants to be able to handle. And now there's no algae. And that happened overnight, literally.
Wow. There's people that talk about like non-testable elements and hormones and stuff like that fish produce that can only be cleared with water changes. You're an advocate of not doing water changes. How does that work, and how do you get through that sort of scenario?
By doing a little more research and realizing that those hormones have a half-life of about 1 minute.
Right.
The hormone does not survive. It breaks down almost immediately. It does not survive in the water column as a hormone.
That's really interesting.
And that's the research. I mean, that's solid research behind that.
Wow. So basically that argument that people have is a moot point.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, fish produce hormones. The hormones last about a minute.
Wow. Part of the research, do you know how long these hormone cycles last for? Is it just a quick blast once every few weeks, or is it a cycle in the fish?
It depends on what the fish is doing. If it's breeding, then there will be hormones it's putting out for breeding. And that'll last for as long as it's breeding. I mean, that could go on for months.
Interesting. Ethan has asked, do you have a source for that statement, or the research behind that or from that?
Yes, I do. Yeah, if you will go on our shoal, the Fatherfish Shoal, which is a Discord channel, and raise the issue with their residential botanist, biologist, researcher, who's also the manager of the site, Maeve. She will give you the chapter and verse.
Cool. Can you chuck that in the chat, John, if you can find it, please?
Yeah, you find the link at fatherfish.fish.
Right, I'll look at that then.
Cool, thank you. Obviously, the base of your work is around planted aquariums. Something I've been curious with is things, like we spoke about before, African cichlids that rip, pull, dig. Some people get lucky with plants and Africans, but a vast majority, it's kind of an exception to the rule that that'll work. Is there a way that what you do will work with African cichlids, or is it just a non-go, or other fish that destroy plants?
The soil does not require plants. It is simply a way to be able to balance the system. But what is required is some kind of uh, some kind of some kind of CO2 consuming material like algae. For Africans, if if you build it with a lot of hardscape, rock type hardscape, not even wood, but rock, and then put strong lights on it, algae will grow on those lights, now on those rocks. Now, the African cichlids, 50% of their natural food is algae. Their dentition, their mouths, their teeth are shaped to be able to scrape algae, certain types and certain depths, certain thicknesses of algae. So they require algae in their natural diet as part of their natural diet. You can grow that with a lot of hardscape and strong lighting, and that will then provide the balance in the environment that's needed in order to be able, to have a balanced environment where you're not going to, again, have to be doing water changes every 3 days or 7 days or whatever. If you got a lot of algae, and it'll be a tight, hard algae that'll grow on those rocks. It's not going to be something with a lot of filaments. It'll be a hard, short, tight algae that the fish will scrape off of the rock.
Right. So, because we're using Africans for this example, so in African cichlid tanks, replacing the plants with an algae type organism is how that kind of continues to work for not having to do the water changes, because the water remains purer because the algae is taking the nutrients. Is that correct?
I would say so. Now, I have plants growing in my African tanks. I have Amazon swords. I have Aponogetons. And they really don't get chewed up. The critical thing about planting with fish that terrorize plants is to have a lot of them. Don't have one or two plants, have 10 or 20 plants. And what will happen is the fish will tear up one plant and leave the rest alone. And then when that one's gone, you can replace the one. They just don't tear up everything. If you have one plant, they're going to tear it up. If you have the 10, they won't tear up all 10. They'll go after one or two.
So just going back to something you said earlier, I've always thought that with your methodology, it is that the soil and the plants are the combination together, and those two elements are what that make the way that you keep aquariums the way they are. But you sort of touched on that there are two separate elements then, and the soil can do a lot of heavy hitting, and then the plants can do a lot of heavy hitting. Is that correct, or do they have to be?
I think that's right. I've had tanks, deep substrate tanks with no plants for whatever reason, and the plants. The tank remains stable and the fish remain healthy. So that it's. I think what happens is there's a lot of microalgae in the sand, in the soil, that's consuming the animal waste.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Okay, yep, making sense. Jody would like to know, do you have a suggestion on how to beat Claudophora algae?
The what?
Yeah,
What kind of algae?
Claudophora?
I don't know what that is. What is that?
I don't know. First time I've
I
heard
don't
that
know.
one as well.
I don't know whether. Tell him to describe it. There are certain algae that certainly are nasty. But I think generally, well, the algae I was just talking about was really nasty. It was growing like a filament on all the leaves on the plants.
Yeah, it's a filamentous green algae.
Nasty stuff. But what I realized finally, when I finally was able to deal with it, I have a big this thing right here. Let me show you. I'll twist it up. There. This is about a, I don't know, 300-gallon pond. It's loaded with plants. I don't know if you can see them. It's also got a lot of goldfish and other things in it. When I get a plant with a lot of algae, I put it in here, and it gets cleaned up pretty quick. These guys do an amazing job. But what I discovered, this is the tank I've been talking about. This tank had horrible algae in it. You may even see a little left.
Yeah, you can see a little bit at the back.
It's purling. Everything's purling. My word, look at the purling. Incredible. I added another, see this line? That's where it was. I added another ½ inch of sand, and it absolutely stopped the algae growth. It was simply a matter of too much nutrient in the water column. Now, it was just that simple. And it took me weeks to figure it out. I kept trying to control the algae, you know. And that wasn't the problem. The problem was the algae was feeding on excess nutrient in the water column.
So how do you counter that balance? You mentioned earlier you put some more sand down.
Yeah.
And that helped obviously
That
stop the nutrients leaching.
I put a ½ inch of sand. I did that 4 days ago. I did it Sunday, I think. And it has completely balanced the tank. There's no problem with it anymore. Everything in there was covered in algae.
So I'm assuming that if you've got this balance that's continuously being leached out, you put the sand cap over top, the leaching stops, then the large body of plant mass then absorbs said excess at a really rapid rate because it needs it to grow, or just pulls it in, and that balance is pretty much at a quick give or take couple of days type of scenario.
Right.
How that works?
Right. I was astounded, frankly. It happened so quickly. And this is all new growth popping out here.
Oh, yeah.
In like 2 days.
Cool. So Jody has said that it is a hard filament algae that she was asking about, and that it has managed to stick to glass, grow in the substrate, and surround plants. I have used Father Fish's method of planting, and I don't use much fertilizers. I let the fish waste feed on plants.
Yeah, I would not use any fertilizer at all. The problem with fertilizer is you're really not helping the plant. You're ultimately harming the plant, and you're creating a kind of a false environment. Most of the organic gardeners have completely abandoned fertilizer because they find that it breaks down the natural biology of the system. It acts like fire. It's a destructive influence. Now there are farmers who absolutely are dependent upon it, because that's the nature of their system. But more and more farmers are getting away from it by working on the quality of their soil,
Mm-hmm.
improving the quality of their soil.
Cool. We've got one more question from the viewer, and then we'll let John crack into some more. Jess would like to know, is there a certain fish that help contain algae getting out of control, or do you just apply this is my little add-on, or do you just apply it's overbalanced, I'll correct it with substrate?
Well, we put Florida flags in that tank, and I got to admit, I think it helped.
Yeah.
Florida flags are uniquely, mollies are another one. They're really effective at eating algae.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, autosynclets. I mean, there are a lot of things that they will control algae.
So if we can just go back a little bit on the deep substrate maintenance, obviously water changes are not a big thing when you're doing it this method, but you did say it is necessary sometimes. And I wondered,
Absolutely. You do it when you need to do it. Do it. That's the difference is you're not doing water changes for the sake of doing water changes.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing water changes because there's a good reason to do it.
Yeah. And how do you go about doing a water change on a deep substrate setup? That's the question.
I rarely do more than, I never do more than 25%. I usually will only do 10%.
Right. And
what do you fire away, John?
I was going to say, do you go anywhere near the substrate, or do you just?
No, I don't. I do not.
Okay.
I take it pretty, unless there's a lot of mulm that I want to siphon out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But anymore, I'm committed to mulm. I want more of it because it is a nesting ground for microfauna.
Yeah.
And if you've got fish that are going to spawn like tetras that are going to throw eggs into that's providing a nest for baby fish to grow in.
You said before, unless there's a good reason to do a water change, doing your style of aquariums, what becomes a good reason to do a water change?
Yeah.
Well, the water may become discolored, and you don't like the color, and charcoal's not getting it out. It may develop, and there may be an emergency, or it develops an odor, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
You may have put medication in there and need to get the medication out. I mean, and anything that's gonna that any situation in which the water becomes problematic.
Right.
So how as a
But see, here's the thing that's important to understand. The problem is never the water. The problem is what is in the water.
Mm-hmm.
The water itself is H2O. That's never the problem. The problem is there is something in the water that's causing problems.
Yeah, definitely. So if you were giving advice to somebody that was new to deep substrate aquariums, how would they approach resolving a problem with their water parameters, for example?
I missed that. Do that again.
If you were giving advice to somebody that's fairly new to the hobby, or even just the deep substrate setups, how would you tell them to deal with an issue with their water parameters?
Well, what I would tell them is to observe the plants and observe the fish. If the fish are acting normal and they're happy, there's no reason to do anything.
So really, just approach it in the same way you would with any other kind of aquarium having a water parameter problem.
Yeah, there's a water problem if there's something going on in the tank that's not good.
Yeah.
Then there's a problem. May not be the water, maybe the dirt, maybe who knows what. It's
Yeah.
probably something in the water.
Definitely.
But changing the water because you did a test tube and it shows the color and you have to change the water because of the color. That's you're being led around by the nose by a number on a piece of paper, and not by what's going on in the tank.
By color, do you like watercolor? Do you mean like if the tannins get too deep for you, or there's like a white, milky, watery color, or a green, watery color? Is that what you're?
Yeah, sure, that kind of thing. There's a thing I refer to as thick water or slimy water, water that just doesn't feel right. And I don't know. That's probably something you have to be around for a long time to get a sense of. I had a friend, man's name was Henry Hall. I met him when he was in his 80s. He had been keeping fish all his life. He could look at water and know what the pH was just by looking at it. I never figured out how he did that. I've never been close to that level. But he maintained, when I first saw his collection, he had 40 fish tanks. The smallest one was 100 gallons. They were all in his basement. He had one fish in every tank. The fish ranged from 2 to 4 feet. He had monster fish.
Wow.
And they were bare tanks. Nothing in them at all. No substrate, nothing. Bare tanks. And he'd been maintaining that for years. And he did it by look and feel. He could feel the water. He would dip his finger in the water, or he would look at it and know what was going on. Look at the fish and know whether the fish was having a problem. It's just really remarkable. He was so tuned into what was happening, but he had an extremely simple environment. It was water and fish. That was it. He had made filters that were plastic trays sitting on top of the tank with foam rubber. And he had lift tubes lifting water into that and filtering through that foam and dripping back into the tank. Did not have lights on the tank. None of them had lights. So there was no algae issue. It was amazing.
I'm just touching back.
He gave me the entire collection. It became the first fish in the National Aquarium.
Wow. Just touching back on your green water thing. So that's obviously an excess of nutrients in the water, and that is an algae that can't be countered by adding extra substrate from leaching. That is a water changing one.
Green water?
Yeah.
No.
Is that what you're saying?
No. Green water is a sign of extreme health. It's an extremely healthy environment. It's not one that makes it easy to see fish, but it's very, very good for the fish because it's producing huge volumes of oxygen. It's absorbing all kinds of nutrients. It's extremely healthy. The best way to clear it up, if you want to clear it up, is to put Daphne in the tank. They'll multiply and clear it up in a matter of a day or two.
Yeah. Okay. And so with waterborne white, milky water.
That's another matter. Milky water is bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know any other thing that causes milky water other than maybe milk. It's bacteria. And that's
how
a
do you,
very, very, very bad sign.
Yeah.
so how do you counter that, or how do you work with that with your methodology? Is that a water change one as well?
Oh, it's worse than that. I mean, generally it happens when a tank crashes. And a tank will crash. It's a cascade effect. I had a tank crash here about a month ago. It was a brackish water tank, and we had I had a pump in it. I had one major circulating pump, and overnight it stopped working. And within an hour, things started dying because the water was not cycling enough for the CO2 to be able to be dispelled at the surface. CO2 can only be expelled at the surface, and oxygen can only be absorbed at the surface. So if the water is still, that can't happen. And in brackish water or salt water, it's even more severe. So by the time I got here, the water was milky white. You could not see through it. There were a few fish, a few mollies on the top gasping for air. So I knew it was done. It had crashed. It had gone through that cascade. One thing dies and begins to deteriorate, and that causes 2 more things to die, and then 8 things, and then 10 things, and then everything. And before long, it's all dead. Everything's dead. The substrate's dead. The inverts dead. Everything's dead. Here's the thing about that, though. I only had little tiny stuff in there. There was nothing big in there. The biggest fish was 1 inch. I had a lot of microfauna, and it was thick with microfauna, thick with macroalgae. And that's what had died. So that's what fouled the water. I turned the pump back on, got it working, and left it alone. Didn't do another thing. By the next day, it was halfway cleared up. In 2 days, the water was crystal clear. All of the dead material had been consumed by the algae. The algae finished its work, had nothing left to live for, so it went away in whatever bacteria heaven or hell it goes to. And the water was left pristine. And the longer it sat there, the better it got. The algae began to return. I found a little crab that survived. Just, it came back. Of course, all the fish I put in it were gone, but but the water was not the problem. It was what was in the water that was the problem. And the bacteria is what was in the water. And without something to feed on, the bacteria disappeared. They go wherever dead bacteria go. They went away.
Yeah. Fish dying is a part and part of the hobby. Everyone has that happen. The general consensus is you have a fish die, remove it, do a water change. Is that the same principle if people have fish that die in your style aquarium, or is it a not do water change? It'll just sort of sort itself. How does that sort of part work?
Obviously, if it's a big fish, you want to get it out because otherwise it's going to foul the water and cause other problems, cause that cascade effect where everything will die. So if you got a 6-inch discus or Oscar in the tank and it dies, you want to get it out. Don't leave it in there. If it's a 1-inch fish, push it down in the sand or leave it alone. Everything else is going to eat it. It'll be food. One thing that's interesting about anytime a fish dies, it instantly is food for absolutely everything. Immediately, everything eats it. So if it's a little tiny one, it's not a problem. If it's a big one, you need to remove it. And if the water starts getting cloudy, I would do a partial water change and get a lot of aeration going. Get air stones in there, really pump the air into it hard. That'll get aeration, because what's happening is the oxygen is being depleted by the explosion of bacteria. That's the first thing it does, is it burns up oxygen.
Okay. We've got another question from the viewers. Ethan would like to know, what are your thoughts on benthic species? I've probably butchered that name, which burrow or shift large amounts of substrate. Also, rheophilic environments where substrate is routinely disturbed and turned over.
I didn't understand any of that. That was a complex question.
So it's a two-part question. What are your thoughts on the benthic species, so fish that burrow or shift large amount of substrates? And the second part is the rheophilic environments where substrate is routinely disturbed or turned over.
Got it. What I do, there are a couple of things. If you've got Central American cichlids that are earth movers and you want to do a deep substrate, then when you put the tank together, put the soil down, add 1/2 inch of sand on it, and then put egg crate on top of the whole thing. And by egg crate, I mean plastic mesh.
Mm-hmm.
The 1/4 inch plastic mesh that's used in drop ceilings. Cover it completely with that, and then put 2 inches of sand on top of it. That way, when they dig, they're not going to be able to dig into the dirt. So you're going to be safe from that problem. Generally, fish that are diggers, well, let me show you. I've got a good example. Let's see if I can. I'm going to have to go into my office. Let me move my camera here, and we're going to be back live where I'll be able to see you.
Cool.
I have a tank here.
Going on an adventure.
Right. Okay, a couple of severums, gold severums. You see what they've done to this?
Yeah.
They've created a mountain. Now, this was a deep substrate dirted tank. But there has not been we've cleaned it out once or twice, really not substantially. What's happened, though, if you look at this, the dirt has all gone back down into the sand. See, can you see the strata there?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So even though they've dug the whole thing up, it sort of reestablished itself. And there is a stand of corkscrew valve here, a really big stand of corkscrew that has not been negatively affected at all. And I had a couple of rocks here. What they wanted to do was get down to hardscape, get down to the bottom, which they've done. They're not digging anymore. They've gotten to where they want to go. They've hit the bottom. And it's, I've left it because it's stable. It ain't pretty by any stretch, and it's kind of weird. And they've never spawned. I think I've got 2 males or 2 females. Actually, there are 3 of them in here. They've yet to spawn. I don't know what the problem is. I can't tell what's wrong. They won't spawn. They just. I think they're all the same sex. That looks for all the world like a male.
Yeah, the fins are looking.
And the other one does too. There's a third one in here. Come on out. Come on out. He's hiding in the back. He's a little smaller. Anyway, that's a good example of what you're talking about. That's real earth movers that work. And it really has not, I mean, it's changed it certainly, but it's allowed, it has maintained itself as a dirty deep substrate tank with plants growing in it. Not one I'd put on display, but there it is.
It appears that a lot of your aquariums are quite low flow. How would you work with fish that want a high flow with them?
I do. I have high flow tanks.
Okay.
Let me see. I've got one I think I can show you. Let me get my. I've got this on a long cable here. We were talking about Africans. That's a 120.
Mm-hmm.
It's got plants in it, a bunch of Africans, and a pretty good flow. So yeah, I do high flow,
Cool. Yeah, it just appeared that a lot of them were quite quite low flow, but there's
absolutely. And I do prefer low flow. All of my little tanks are low flow. This is low flow. This is low flow. Even this, I don't have any flow in there to speak of. I've got 2 sponge filters in it.
Cool.
I do have a couple of tanks with canisters. This actually has a canister in it because it was getting so much tannins. We wanted to push the water through carbon, so we set up this little guy with a lot of carbon in it to try to get the tannins, and it's working pretty well. I mean, you actually see through to the other side of the tank now. Now, here's a good example. I've got discus in this tank. This has been set up now for about a month. Never had a water change. And don't plan to do one. There's no good reason to do it. The fish are perfectly happy and healthy in there. There's no reason to do a water change. It's a deep substrate. It's about 6 inches of substrate in here. Got plants growing in it. So forth.
Do you have a preferred style for filtration?
A third style.
Preferred style.
I'm sorry?
Is there a method of filtration that you like to use over others?
Yeah, sponge filters.
Yeah.
They're cheap, they're easy, they're biological. They're pretty much maintenance free.
Cool.
Mainly, in most tanks, you don't need much flow.
Mm-hmm.
You do need some. So I don't. There was a period where I was talking about the system as a system that does not require filtering. And in a real sense, it doesn't, because the substrate is the filter. But that doesn't mean it doesn't require some kind of flow, because if you don't have any flow at all, then you're going to get dead pockets where CO2 will dominate and kill everything. So you've got to have a little bit of flow. Plants provide some, but really not much. So I do the sponge filter because that's what it does. It's air bubbles that are creating enough flow so there are no dead areas.
I'm personally not a fan of sponge filters, but if I'm putting air in a tank, I'm putting a sponge filter in it because why not
Yeah,
get that extra capability with it than just an air stone?
Exactly right. That's exactly how I feel. I'd rather do a sponge filter than an air stone.
Great.
Because, right, why not?
Yeah.
It adds a little more biology, a little more filtration. It just polishes it a little better.
Yeah.
It's certainly obtrusive. They're not pretty. They're not nice centerpieces. But, you can overlook them. You can put something in front of them.
Yeah.
Great. Couple of big plants. There you go.
Yeah.
So have you, when you compare a deep substrate aquarium to a normal substrate depth aquarium, have you noticed any difference in the fish behaviour? Like, do fish behave differently in a deep substrate?
Well, yeah, the first thing is the fish are not stressed.
Right.
Here's a good example. I was watching a video recently, a couple of them actually, where one guy had a big 200-gallon tank, 6-foot tank, with a 6-inch arowana in it. And that fish was darting. It was a bare tank, darting one end to the other. And he said, look how happy that fish is. He's just swimming all over. The fish was in a state of absolute panic because it could not find a place to be safe. Another person, my betta loves to swim. I put him in a big tank and he swims all over it. He loves it. Same thing. The fish is in a state of panic. It's not happy. It's not delighted to be able to, bettas are not delighted to be able to swim around all over the place. If they're forced to, they're very unhappy about it because they want to be in a little place where they can be safe. I had a video taken down by YouTube because somebody complained that I was abusing fish by putting bettas in small containers. And YouTube took it down. And I appealed it, and I could not get a human being to look at it. It was all done by machine. So, that's the point where I realized I could not depend on YouTube to be a rational, reasonable, secure place for my enterprise and my business. So what I'm doing now is I'm going on all of the platforms with the same video every week, putting it out everywhere, and then inviting people to my store, to my Discord, to my Patreon, to buy my book, to get involved in all of the other things I'm doing. In other words, I'm using the social platforms as a way of bringing people into, and we're even talking about doing a forum now, a public forum that people will be able to come on. I don't know. We probably will wind up doing it. I kind of don't want to because you can't monetize it, and I really need to be able to monetize stuff. Because it's expensive to do all this. I've got 8 people on staff right now. Doing shipping,
sure it's not cheap running a fish shop.
Well, not just that. I've got people writing a book. that'll be published by the end of the year. We'll have it
Cool.
published. It's a 500-page tome on natural aquariums. And it's
Cool.
pretty scientific. I mean, it's written in layman's terms, but it's loaded with science. I've got the Discord that has full-time staff. I have a full-time editor doing my videos. I have a guy doing all the online, doing all the online stuff. I pay him. I've got staff working here at the shop. I mean, they're probably missing. Yeah, I'm missing a couple of people I can think of. I got 8 people right now I'm paying. Now, they're not all full-time. Only a couple of them are here at the shop. But that's money going out. I mean, that's what it costs to do all this stuff.
Mhm.
It's not free. It's not cheap. It's expensive. And I can't depend on YouTube for any of it. A year ago, I'll get on my high horse now. A year ago, I was at 25,000 subscribers, getting 10,000 views a month. I was making, at 20,000 views, I was making $5,000 a month.
Wow.
Pretty good money.
Mm.
Today, I am at 1 million views a month. I make $2,500 from YouTube.
Doesn't seem to matter.
1 million views a month, and I'm making $2,500.
How does that maths work? What's happened? What's changed?
They're paying less. They used to pay a penny per what? There's like a penny per view. They're now paying a penny per 100 views.
Right. Wow.
1 penny. 100 people have to watch my video for me to earn 1 cent. It's nothing. It's
Almost seems worthless.
it's not worth it. You know, the only value is it reaches a large number of people.
Mm.
And it does. So, but even that, it's only reaching those people that the algorithm decides it wants to reach. So there's a huge number of people. I'm sure 99% of the people who watch you have never heard of me on YouTube.
I'm sure it's probably the opposite way around.
What do you think? But it's amazing, even in the fish tube, it's amazing how many people who watch tropical fish stuff, and particularly in other countries, have never heard of father fish. I mean, I run into it constantly. Oh, I never heard of it. There are probably 10 million people worldwide who are watching fish videos on YouTube on a regular basis. There are not, I've got 250,000 subscribers with a viewership of about 10,000 different people about. So there are probably 10,000 people watching my videos, an average of 10 times or whatever it is. You know, it's 1 million views, but it's not 1 million people, you know.
Yeah.
So
As
my goal is to get on as many of the platforms as possible and try to get out on them in order to reach more people and inform them of what we're doing, so they can those who are interested can get involved in some of the stuff we're doing.
As they say in the business, it's all vanity numbers.
It is. Subscribers are absolutely all vanity. It means subscribers really means nothing. It's views that matter. And anymore, that doesn't even matter if your goal is to make money at it. You can't make money at it anymore. You got to have a business. And YouTube has even recognized that, because that's what they promote. They promote business. They promote you going into business, selling something or selling a service doing something to make money, and then they sell your ads for that.
Yeah. It's a big money spinning machine for old Uncle Google.
Yeah, they're all about their profits. That's what they're all about.
When you like your method of aquarium keeping to like the high intensity aquascaping aquarium are so vastly different. What are your opinions and thoughts on that style of keeping planted tanks?
I think MD is an absolute genius. I think he is brilliant, and I think what he does is magnificent. I've talked to him, and he does feel a kinship with what I'm doing. So I feel like there's the potential for some real growth there to be able to do. I have no artistic skill. I can't make a beautiful tank the way he can. I just don't even have the beginning of an idea of how to go about that. I'm not artistic in that sense. Um, but he could. The reason he doesn't do what I'm doing is because he doesn't put together a tank to last forever. He puts it together to create a show with it for a period of time, and then he breaks it down and does something else with it. And that's fine. I mean, that's what that is. You know, that's not what I do. I create a tank to last forever. And I think, frankly, most hobbyists do that. I think most hobbyists are really trying to create something stable that's going to be there, that they can grow plants in or raise fish in or, you know, whatever. That they don't have
I think I agree. The short term turnaround on aquascaping, particularly with the like competitive ones compared to people at home.
Oh yeah,
totally contrasting style or thought pattern. But obviously they're doing a lot more water changes. They're heavily planting tanks like you are, and they're using fertilizers and CO2s and high tech stuff, which clearly doesn't align with your methodology. Do you think that's, you know, for ones that are setting up for long term use, do you think it's the right approach or not the right approach, or how does that sit with you?
Well, there are people doing Dutch systems, long approach, trying to create permanent systems. What happens is they wind up tearing it down in about a year because it gets leggy, it gets out of hand. The plants are become impossible to be able to work with anymore. The biology isn't working. It just doesn't last. Nobody doing that level of tank has got one 10 years old, I dare say. I'd like to see it if there is.
Yep, that's probably a fair call. I would suspect that they are not running for that full length of time.
Right. And they're not interested in, you know, that's not their goal. That's not what they're trying to do.
Correct.
And there's the other group you mentioned, which is the guys who are doing these beautifully sculpted tanks for the sake of taking a picture and entering a contest. You know, that's a whole other thing. Those are tanks that last 3 to 6 months until they get grown out just so they're just perfect. They get a picture, they tear it down and move on, do something else with that tank.
Yeah, but again, that's it's a totally different world.
It is, that's right.
Absolutely. It's like, and every aspect of almost every hobby have got different.
I have no judgment about that at all. Hey, if that's what you're doing, that's amazing, and I think it's brilliant. You know, there are things that people do that they're just mind-boggling with sculpting and aquascaping. This amazing stuff.
Yeah, it's a skill that I definitely don't have, and I suspect I may never have.
I'm not even close.
So, right at the start, you said that you kind of fell into the aquarium hobby from birth. So you've lived with it for 83 years. Obviously, you'll have seen a lot of changes through that time. Where can you see the aquarium hobby heading now? You know, from what's happening at the moment, what you're hearing about through the industry and through the hobbyists.
I can only answer that in light of what I'm trying to do to impact it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, really,
Okay.
because I'm all about breaking down the tyranny of a techno approach to aquarium keeping, because I think it's the destruction of the hobby. And I think along with that is going to go things like laws that will prohibit all kinds of animals, all kinds of fish from being traded in. We'll wind up with a half a dozen goldfish that we're allowed to keep. It just, I think it's a terminal direction to go in. And
Mm-hmm.
all it does is it provides a financial foundation for big box stores and manufacturers to sell a lot of product. And I don't think that's what the hobby is about. I
Okay.
think the hobby is about plants and fish.
Yeah. So getting back to basics and stripping away all the high tech inventions and getting down to wet arms, dirted tanks, and just
Yeah,
enjoying what nature does best.
and I'm not against technology. I mean,
Yeah.
I use air pumps, I use lights, I use heaters, I use filters, I use fish nets,
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing. I use, and I would be lost without it, frankly. But I don't do RO.
Mm-hmm.
I've done RO. I don't do RO because RO kills. Its function is to kill. That's its function. It's used to kill, and anything that kills is ultimately going to kill everything. It'll start killing this and that, and then eventually everything dies because the what's been put in place is a killing machine, a killing approach.
Mm.
Same with
Someone's
chemicals.
actually,
That's what chemicals are all about. Chemicals are all about killing things.
someone's put up a comment in the chat here. They said fish are decorations in those tanks, and that are rather the fish be the focal point. It's interesting because I've had a couple conversations with different people, and like we all keep aquariums, but there's people that are fish focused, and there's people that are sort of plant focused, and you're a fish person or a plant person, which I think is a very interesting point that this watch has brought up, and I can sort of see with your
Yeah,
methodology that
I know.
work
I
is a bit of both.
that's what so much of the saltwater hobby is about. It's about spectacular looking fish in a display that is stunning.
Mm,
And it is. I mean,
mm,
it really is. But when you get down to it, after about 25 years of that, you begin caring about the fish and you begin wondering how they normally live and what they do, how they breed, what they like to eat, how big they get, where they live, what their natural environment is. When you really get into the animals, then you've gotten past the 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 purely aesthetics of keeping them and are into the husbandry of the animal. And that's about all I got to say about that, really. I mean, I can appreciate a lot of people have fish tanks because they're pretty.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's where they wind up, they really haven't gone very deeply into the life of what they're doing. It's a living animal. It's not a picture on a wall. It's not a photograph. It's not a video. It's a living animal.
Hmm.
And ultimately you got to deal with it as a living animal.
Yeah, I agree. That brings us to the end of our structured questions. John, do you have any more questions you'd like to ask?
No, that was the last one that I really wanted to dive into.
Cool. Okay.
Thank you.
We like to end our Finatics Friday Coffee Date with what we call a quick score of 6. It is 6 short answer questions. They're not meant to stump you, but every now and then they do. So the first question that I have for you is, doing a coin toss, do you call heads or tails?
Heads.
Cool. Are you a tea or a coffee drinker?
Coffee.
Are we alone in the universe?
No.
Cool. If you could have a meal with someone alive or dead, fictional or real, from any point in time, who would that be?
My father.
Cool. Paper, scissors, rocks. What's your first call?
Probably rock.
Cool. What is your unicorn fish? One that you've either never kept, never seen, never spawned, one that you just want to have or be around?
Abba. Gymnarchus niloticus.
Cool. I've never heard of that. I'm going to have to Google that in a minute.
The Nile River fish.
Cool. And my last question for you, which ends up being 7, is, where can people find you if they're looking for you?
Fatherfish.fish.
Fatherfish.fish. Excellent.
Fatherfish.fish.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time. It's been greatly appreciated.
Gentlemen, I enjoyed being here. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's been wonderful for me.
Cool. It's been a lovely couple of hours. It's been nice to get to know you and get to know your methodology a little bit better. And I'm sure the people that are watching have enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody who has been with us today. I hope you have an enjoyable evening, day, afternoon, wherever it is, for whatever time of the day it is for you.
God bless.
Have a good one. Happy fish keeping. Catch you later.
Bye.
Bye for now.